But I want to start, rather than starting with my own experience, I want to start and read you a story, one little story that comes out of a book called Annie. Let me tell you a little bit about Annie. Annie was an old order Mennonite girl, as were my grandparents. Now, the old order Mennonites, if you were to go and see them today, you might mistake them for Amish. But they would quickly tell you, no, they're not Amish. They are ultra-conservative, old order Mennonites. Those old order Mennonites came, as all the Mennonites did, from Switzerland and the Black Forest area of Germany, coming across initially to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and settling there. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather built a stone cottage between Mannheim and Lititz on what is now Doe Run Road beside a spring. And that's where they set up residence. His son, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, built a big farmhouse across the front. And on the wall of that farmhouse, there is a stone that says, David Gingrich, 1805. I visited that house. I've been through the downstairs portion of it. It's wonderful to walk through that kind of history that relates to your own family. After the War of 1812, a lot of those ultra-conservative Mennonites were just a little bit uncomfortable with this new country that had come out of the 13 colonies. They felt that they had had peace under the British Crown, and they weren't sure whether that peace was going to continue through some of the things that they saw taking place. And so that group of people began to migrate north into Canada. They went up through what is Elmira, New York today, and then followed the south shore of Lake Ontario, floated their wagons and their horses across the lower Niagara River, crossing into British territory, and then traveling north up into the Grand River Valley, which is my home, where I come from. And there they settled. They were given tracts of land by the British Crown, free, just for clearing, settling. That area turned out to be some of the best farmland in all of Ontario. And they have been a very prosperous people in that area. My grandparents were born into that, and so was Annie. But in the early 1930s, the winds of change began to happen. First of all, there was some groups that began a very heretical teaching to those old order Mennonites. And that teaching was that you could know that you were saved. Those old Mennonites, they couldn't accept that. They just lived according to the grace of God and hoped that they might make it. But this new teaching was that you could know that you were saved. And then following very closely behind that was the Pentecostal movement, which brought in a whole new dimension of things. My grandmother had suffered an accident in a sleigh, and it's recorded here in chapter 5 of Annie's biography because it was very significant to Annie. Annie became very significant to me. I'll explain that in a minute. But let me read this. Annie's introduction to Pentecost came through an outstanding healing. Among those her group visited was a young farm wife, Mrs. David Gingrich. Not Marg, my grandmother. Her leg had been badly injured in an accident. With the aid of crutches, she endeavored to care for her husband and 2 small sons, one of them being my father, all the while receiving treatment from the doctors. Having exhausted every known remedy without success, the doctors gave their verdict. The leg must be amputated. Gangrene was setting in. This was a crushing blow to the young couple. About this time, they heard of a Pentecostal camp meeting at nearby Woodstock, where a British evangelist was praying for the sick with some outstanding results. While they did not accept the Pentecostal doctrine, in their despair, they were willing to clutch at any straw. With another young couple, they decided to attend. They fasted that morning and arrived in time for the first service. But what kind of service was this? Such noise, such loud singing and praying and praising. How could this be of the Lord? They simply could not bring themselves to enter the tent, but by parking close, they were able to hear the evangelist. An alert Pentecostal sister greeted them and learned why they had come, but they still refused to enter the tent. The morning service was over. Then the afternoon service. Still no invitation to those wishing to be healed. Discouraged and weary, the foursome decided to give up and go home. The same woman who had evidently been keeping an eye on them noticed this and spoke to them again. As she had feared, they were going home. She begged them to wait while she went for the evangelist and acquainted him with the situation. He came out immediately and began to pray for Mrs. Gingrich. He prayed once, nothing happened. He prayed again, and nothing happened. He prayed the third time, and this time Mrs. Gingrich was bathed in light, as she expressed it, from her head to her feet. She felt the power of God going through her body, and knowing she was healed, dropped her crutches and began walking around the car, praising God. People gathered quickly. Her husband and the other young couple were electrified. All of them went into the tent and attended the volume and added to the volume of praise that had seemed so objectionable just a short time before. Annie had not heard of this when she went to the next house prayer meeting in Elmira. Her hostess asked, "Annie, have you heard what happened to Sister Gingrich?" "No," Annie replied, fearing the worst. "What happened?" "She can walk. She's been healed. They went to a Pentecostal camp meeting and Jesus healed her." Just then the Gingrichs drove up for the meeting, and Mrs. Gingrich, face aglow with praise to God, came up the steps and walked in. Having known her condition, Annie was struck with amazement. A sense of the holiness and power of God gripped her. She felt unworthy to be in the same room with one so notably touched by him. Could it be true? Did Jesus actually work miracles today? The proof was before her eyes, and a new hunger stirred in her heart. Just a few days later, Annie attended a Pentecostal camp meeting with them, where she was filled with the Holy Spirit. Later received a call to the mission field. She spent 37 years in the country of Liberia as a missionary. She did a tremendous work there. She went into the interior. She worked with the local people. She learned their language. She reduced their language to writing. She wrote readers so that she could teach them to read. Then she translated the New Testament and taught them how to read the New Testament. And then she translated the New Testament again into a very simplified English, which is available online today. The Annie Cressman New Testament, I think it's got another name, but if you put that in, you'll come up with it online. A very simplified English New Testament that the people could read and could understand. 37 years in Liberia. Now, the impact on me came when she would come home on furlough, because she and my grandmother remained lifelong friends. And I know on one of the trips home, I can't remember how old I was, but I was in my teens. And she came home, and I loved to sit at her feet and have her tell me about Africa. She would tell me all these stories of all these things she'd gone through, and it just enthralled me, even as a younger boy. But this time I was in my teens, and she came home and she preached in our church. And at the end of that service, God moved in my heart mightily. And I went up to the altar. And she prayed over me. And I believe that was the birthing of the missionary spirit in me. So she had a tremendous impact on my life. But let me back up from those teen years to the age of 5, when I was 5 years old. In 1952,